Tick-tock, check the clock. It's now time for our Tech Talks.
I'm Annie.
I'm Ariane.
And I'm PJ, and we welcome you to Tech Talks, where we talk about the hottest,
The latest.
And the most exciting tech news. So last week, we talked about the Da Vinci robotic surgical system.
For this week naman, we're gonna talk about camels and the cloning conundrum.
Yes, dahil malapit na ang Annual Endangered Species Day, we chose the article entitled First Cloned Bactrian Camel Calf Produced by Interspecies Somatic Cell Nuclear Transfer, a step towards preserving the critically endangered wild Bactrian camel by Wani, Vertical, and Hong 2017. We'll put a link below if you guys want to read more about it because today we'll just briefly discuss it. So, Annie, ano nga bang ginawa nila sa experiment?
So, the studies were conducted to explore the possibility of using dromedary camel oocytes as recipient cytoplasts for the development of interspecies somatic cell nuclear transfer or ISCNT embryos using skin fibroblast cells of an adult Bactrian camel and llama as donor nuclei. So, this ISCNT that I just mentioned, we'll talk more about it later in this episode. But going back to the study, the embryos reconstructed with Bactrian cells were transferred into the uterus of synchronized dromedary camel recipients to explore the possibility of using them as surrogate mothers. The method for the study involved injecting serum-starved skin fibroblast cells into the perivitelline space of enucleated mature oocytes. So the oocytes were collected from superstimulated dromedary camels. So in the experiment, the blastocysts were transferred to synchronized dromedary recipients, and by the end of the 30-day experimentation period, only one of the pregnancies from the second experiment developed to term, giving birth to a healthy calf after completing 392 days of gestation. So unfortunately, the calf died on day 7. So, to sum it all up lang, the present study reports, for the first time, birth of a cloned Bactrian calf by ISCNT using dromedary camel as source for oocytes as well as surrogate for carrying the pregnancy to term.
Okay, wow. So, mas complicated pala siya than what I thought. So, okay. Correct me if I'm wrong, guys. Pero, tama ba? So, bale, kumuha ng cells from Bactrian camel and llama, tapos ginawang surrogate yung dromedary camels para makapag-clone ng Bactrian camels?
Tama, you are right, Ariane.
Yes, I'm right. Okay, anyway, we actually gathered some listener questions on our social media. And the first question is from Twitter. Sabi dito, why different species yung ginamit sa experiment?
So from what I've said, ISCNT or interspecies somatic cell nuclear transfer yung ginawa nila. So inter means between different species. The main issue kasi is the availability of oocytes and the recipient animals for the cloned embryos because yung wild Bactrian camels are already critically endangered. So the only option was to use a closely related domestic animal species as oocyte donors as well as surrogate mothers to carry the cloned embryos to term. And there are still more things that we have to know about ISCNT, so how about let's go to PJ's Technic Corner.
Somatic cell nuclear transfer is a laboratory technique for creating an ovum with a donor nucleus. In this process, the nucleus of a somatic or donor cell is removed and inserted into a different enucleated egg cell or recipient cell. The somatic cell nucleus is reprogrammed by the host cell after insertion, and through stimulus with a shock, it will begin to divide and eventually form a blastocyst with almost identical DNA to the original organism. ISCNT or interspecies SCNT simply means that the donor and recipient cells come from different species, families, orders, or classes.
Wow! So that's what happens pala in ISCNT.
Oo nga. I think natackle ko yan sa isang subject ko, but nalimutan ko na. So, thank you for that, PJ. And punta naman tayo sa next listener question from Instagram naman. Why did they use dromedary camel as a surrogate? So, siguro ibig niya sabihin, bakit hindi ibang type ng camel, ganun? What do you think, Annie?
ISCNT kasi is more efficient when donor and recipient cells come from closely related species with similar reproductive physiology, gestation period, and placentation. So dromedary and Bactrian camels are closely related species, so they both have diffused epithelio-chorial placentation and similar reproductive physiology.
Yeah, so in line with that, I have a question, parang follow-up question siya. Bakit gumamit pa ng llama aside from the Bactrian camel?
Based dun sa Technic Corner information and sa article, ginamit ang llama as nuclei donor since hindi naman pwedeng yung Bactrian camel ovum ang gamitin because they are already critically endangered. Basically, para sa research na to, nuclear DNA galing sa llama was transferred into the enucleated dromedary camel cell with mitochondrial DNA from the cells of Bactrian camel contained in its oocyte cytoplasm. Yung nuclei from the llama was eventually reprogrammed to produce a Bactrian blastocyst.
So that answers your question, Aryan, and actually question ko din yon kanina pa.
Yes, thank you for that, PJ.
So we have another listener question from Twitter naman. They said that from the study, only one of the pregnancies reached to term. However, after ilang days, the calf died. So ano daw yung reason ba't namatay yung calf?
Okay, so unfortunately, the calf died just 7 days after it was born due to bacterial infection called acute septicemia. Susceptible din kasi yung mga calf natin doon. Kasi although naka-receive sila ng passive protection from maternal immunoglobulins, hindi pa rin sila nakapag-produce ng enough antibodies to produce their own immunoglobulins to defend themselves against the bacteria. And of course, nakaka-affect din yung other factors like transportation, milk production and feeding, and the weather. Pero ayun, even though namatay yung calf just after 7 days, it does not necessarily mean na unsuccessful yung project because kahit namatay yung calf, they're still successful at producing a cloned camel. And first time pa lang nila ginawa yung experiment of cloned Bactrian camel by ISCNT. It's still a novel approach, so marami rin naman silang nakitang points of improvement na pwede gamitin sa further research. Diba, PJ?
Oo, tama ka dyan, Aryan. And not only that, no, it also opened doors for enhanced multiplication and preservation of the wild Bactrian camels na very crucial ngayon, especially since they are already a critically endangered species. And as you said nga kanina, Aryan, marami ring nakitang possible areas of improvement sa experiment na to na pwede nilang i-enhance pa on their future researches.
I agree with that because it's really an issue today, which is why maraming scientists are really finding ways to preserve these critically endangered species.
Yes, it's actually great that they're doing those.
So true. Okay, now that we are acquainted with the underlying concepts of the experiment, let's talk about the risks and benefits of the project. Anong thoughts niyo, guys?
I'd like to start with the benefits. So first is species continuation. Diba kaya naman nila ginagawa in the first place yung cloning na to kasi endangered na yung Bactrian camels. So ayun, it can be used to preserve critically endangered species and maybe even extinct species. So another is cell lines of different animals can be preserved to be used in cloning in the future in the case that the population becomes extinct or endangered. So kahit hindi pa sila extinct or endangered right now, at least prepared na tayo in the future, diba? And it also has the potential to expand genetic variability in the event that the population collapses or becomes extinct.
Aside from what Aryan already mentioned, this research also paves the way for the possibility of xenotransplantation in the future. After this technique has been perfected in animal models, it could also be implemented on human models in the future. Pero ayun nga, medyo sensitive siya na topic kasi nga when we involve human models, usually it's more delicate in the sense na there is a huge area wherein ethics comes into play. Hindi naman natin pwedeng basta-basta na lang i-fuse ang cellular components ng animals into human cells and also vice versa.
Yeah. How about you, Annie? Anong namang thoughts mo?
So you guys talked about the benefits na. So I'm gonna talk about the risks naman of using ISCNT. So first is limited availability of recipient species and oocytes since nga we're dealing with critically endangered species. And another is that yung early death of embryos. Also yung low life expectancy. And I think one of the most obvious na parang effect is yung reduction ng genetic variability since cloning involves reproduction of exactly the same genes.
Yes, may input din ako sa risk. So, other complications regarding the cloning technique are, first, it may result in large offspring syndrome or high rate of pregnancy loss and high rates of morbidity and mortality in the postnatal period. There are also gestational complications which affect both the surrogate organism and the progeny. So, they may become more at risk for diseases.
Tama ka dyan, Aryan. Ang rami pala ng risks associated with the experiment aside from the benefits, no? And since we've already identified these benefits and risks, why don't we make it more interesting para naman maalog mga utak natin?
Yes, nag-invite kami ng dalawang friends na willing mag-share ng stand nila towards this topic. So we have Clarissa and Leomer waiting on the line. First, let's hear from Clarissa.
I approve of the application of this type of study. As a BS Bio student, the concept of cloning brings many benefits and advantages, especially when it comes to ecology and agriculture. This technology can preserve critically endangered species and even bring back extinct species which are vital in maintaining the balance in our ecosystems. In agriculture, cloning is beneficial in such a way that it can reproduce organisms that are resistant to diseases, which reduces the overall cost of chemicals, and organisms that contain favorable traits such as having larger sizes, able to recreate regardless of seasonal changes, and rapid reproduction. I think these innovations can bring advantages to the agricultural sector by lessening the overall production cost and reproduction time of agricultural products while at the same time increasing and enhancing their value and characteristics.
Thank you for that, Clarissa. Ngayon naman, pumunta tayo kay Leomer.
I am against the application of such a study. This is because cloning is not sustainable for the organisms involved. The animals that cloning produces have low life expectancy and high risk of many diseases. If cloning is approved, they may not mature or even reproduce to create genetic variability. The effort and resources needed for cloning could be used in other scientific pursuits that are needed now as new problems arise.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Leomer. Annie, what do you think with their insights?
I agree with Clarissa kasi this experiment is particularly useful in preserving endangered species, especially na yung extinction rates today are much higher than would be expected due to increasing human-driven environmental pressures such as deforestation and climate change. So, a lot of wildlife conservation organizations are really supporting scientists working to use genomics to protect yung biodiversity natin.
Ako naman, I agree with Leomer that we have some significant risks to consider. But I think this is one of the times na yung risks are worth taking. Kasi I think there are ways to minimize the risk. And I think mas mag-i-improve lang yung methods as time go by. So, for me, the benefits that we can get from this type of research can outweigh the risks.
Tama, and I would just like to emphasize actually na may mga ethical issues din na kailangan i-take into account. Not just sa ISCNT studies, but also with other genetic engineering and biotech practices. And to discuss more on this, let's go have a chat in PJ's Technic Corner.
Everything in this world can be used for good and for evil. In general, when we talk about animal models, the possible risks of genetic engineering and biotechnology outweigh its benefits. With our current technology, editing genes is still quite unsafe, which can result in the death of various organisms being studied. In this aspect, we also risk the introduction of mutations to animal species which represent human diseases. This creates the possibility of eradicating an entire species, thus affecting the environment negatively by decreasing biodiversity. However, once we talk about human models, everything is even more complicated. Most ethicists and philosophers state that the idea of creating human offspring through this technology takes away human dignity, as stated by Leon Kass. This method is also considered very egocentric and selfish, since it only considers passing its own exact genes to the next generation without thinking of the possible reduction in variability among humans. Moreover, parents may also view their clones as designed objects to be used as they deem necessary, rather than being humans and their own different selves. As you may recall in Mark Romanek's 2010 movie Never Let Me Go, clones were used solely for the purpose of being able to donate their organs when the time comes that their parents need them.
Wow, that was some insightful discussion about camels and cloning, right guys?
Yes, so insightful. So grabe no, sobrang powerful ng mga genetic technologies and kaya talaga nilang mag-produce ng mga promising innovations na makakatulong sa atin if used in the right way.
Tama ka dyan, Ariane. And so guys, that concludes our episode. We thank you guys for tuning in with us here at TechTalks. And if you have any further questions, just email us at techtalkspodcast@gmail.com.
Or find us on Twitter and Instagram at TechTalks Podcast. This has been Annie,
Ariane,
And PJ.
clocking out!